Okay, so can you introduce yourself to get us started, please?
Yes. So my name is Giulia Cuccato. I work in a government office for science, which is the group of people that support the government chief scientific advisor, who is the main scientist that provides advice to the prime minister and government in general. My current role in Go Science is, well, what I do is try to get us to make the best use of our academic base to inform policy. So providing evidence and research and science advice into policy.
Can you expand a little bit on what motivated you to pursue a career at the intersection of science and policy?
I guess as a deep subject scientist, I felt that was a very personal feeling, at times a little bit detached from reality, from what was going on outside of the lab, from what was happening in the so-called real world. Not that my world wasn't real, but the world of the other people that were out of the lab. I only felt like I could touch that word a little bit when I was going to conferences, when I was meeting other people. And I could realize then that what I was doing had a meaning for society and had a meaning for the rest of the world. But it just didn't feel right for me anymore at some point. So I decided, yes, that I needed to be more involved in a practical way with the communication of science and with making science being used a little bit rather than creating it. Making sure that it went somewhere, if that makes sense.
What kinds of research evidence tends to survive or tends to make it into policy or into policy discussions?
What survives is what hits very well the priorities of the moment. So if it talks to the high-level objectives, the high-level strategies that have been published, and a lot of time government does publish, and it's not just areas of research interest, but like the science and technology framework, for example. There are papers that come out of government and that outline what's important. So if it talks to those kind of lines, and literally it's about using the same words sometimes so that they resonate in people's minds, and what is short, backed by good evidence and very, very to the point, that survives.
How can researchers maximize the chances that their work makes a difference in the policy process?
A lot of it is learning to speak the right language, which is slightly different in government than the one that is used in academia. A researcher needs to learn a little bit what the culture is, basically, in government, to be able to communicate in the right way and to what we call land their message in the right places. There's something to be said about I think a very, very important thing is nurturing relationships with people that work in government, because that's what teaches you ultimately what the culture is and how you can work with that. Through those relationships, then researchers will be able to understand also what the priorities are. So policy moves quite fast a lot of times, which can be a problem for matching the times of research with the demands of policy. But if you know already as a researcher, if you cultivate those relationships and you know what the priorities are, then you'll be able to direct your research in the right way to respond to those questions. One of the things we have found, I found in my work, is that, for example, I've been encouraging departments to write their areas of research interest, which are the main topics of research they might be interested in. So those are a very good place to look when you're trying to understand what government is interested in. We've also recently developed a database that collects all of those areas of research interest, making it really easy to search through them for topic. And I found with my work, the work in my team, that a lot of those ARIs, areas of research interest, more often than not, already have some kind of answer out there in the research area. So it really is just about connecting the dots and knowing who is interested in government on something and connect with those people.
How do you see the process of scientific evidence influencing policy evolving in the future? So are there some emerging trends that you're seeing in this space?
I can see us interacting in a more proactive way, us meaning government and academia, in the future, especially using, for example, the areas of research interest are a very, very important tool because they do go some way opening the box of what government is interested in for academia because they're published. So they are out there. And starting from those, like I said, we can create a network of interactions that is more meaningful and more based on like specific themes, in a sense. I mean, the UK has got a fantastic academic base, but in a sense, it needs to be primed to work with policy more because that is ultimately what changes the nation's life. In a sense, it's almost a responsibility as an academic to interact with policy because that's what ultimately is going to make a difference.
Fantastic. So you've mentioned the sort of speaking the language and the networking aspects, but for researchers who are interested in influencing policy or adding value to the policy process, what are some specific skills that you would recommend they develop?
So it's about building relationships, stakeholder engagement. These are very, very important skills. Patience, I would say, needs a bit of patience, needs empathy, capacity to understand another word and another way of working, which might be dictated by other rules that need to be respected. Writing skills are fundamental. I think it's really, really important to understand how to write very, very briefly and to the point, which I think is a very different style to the one of academic writing in general. So like a policymaker will have very, very little time, more often than not. So messages need to be conveyed in the quickest and more direct way possible. And then, like I said, just I think the main thing is remembering there's another person on the other side. Obviously, we are working on important topics and on important arguments, but it is a people's job. And everyone needs to remember there's another person on the other side with other priorities, other needs, and other rules to follow. And I think that's a very, very important skill.